Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Kathleen Reardon. I am the CEO of the New Hampshire Center for Nonprofits, and we are so pleased to welcome you all here today for this very exciting conversation about governance matters. We have more than 180 individuals registered, and I know some are still calling in. So that is just one of the wonders of being able to have this session virtually. So we are seeing people join us from all corners of the country, as well as even Ontario today, which is quite exciting for us. We are so thrilled to be able to bring this forum to you in partnership with St. Anselm College and the Center for Ethics in Business and Governance. The center has been working, the New Hampshire Center for Nonprofits has been working with St. A's and their center for the past several years on really elevating conversations around governance through the governance forum. And we're able to bring this particular workshop to you free of charge because of that partnership. The center's work is supported by an endowment that was created by the New Hampshire Secretary of State office with a settlement from Tyco. And so they've been dedicating a lot of time and effort into helping boards of both for-profit and nonprofit organizations understand ethical governance and how important that is for our society and our futures, and have partnered with the center specifically related to nonprofit governance. So we're really thrilled to have that ongoing partnership and be able to bring really fabulous speakers and conversations to New Hampshire and with that support. A couple of housekeeping items. I see that people are, entering in the chat who they are, and that's a wonderful use of the chat. As we get into the presentation, if you want to ask a question, we do ask you use the Q&A feature. That makes it a little bit easier for us to facilitate that. We will be Dr. Trower will be going through a lot of information and doing some presentation, and she'll pause a couple of times, probably about halfway through, to see what questions are there. And my colleague Kelly Wing will be reading those out, and in some cases maybe kind of lumping questions together because we do have such a great number of you joining us. We want to do our best to get to all the areas of inquiry that we can. And then another thing, as we noted at the top, this session is being recorded. We'll send out later today an evaluation, which will also include the link to the recording and to the slides for the presentation. So I think that that's the basic housekeeping items. If there are any questions, again, use the Q&A feature. And we do encourage you to use that because we want to have some interactiveness as much as possible in this forum. So again, I'm so pleased to welcome Dr. Cathy Trower to our conversation today and lead us. Many of you are very familiar with her work. She does extensive consulting with more than 250 nonprofits across the country, or she's touched through her consulting work that many organizations. She is the author of several books, including the really focus on the governance as leadership model. And that's particularly why we invited her for this forum today, because, if there's ever a time that we need to really think about governance in a very cohesive way and do our best work in the boardroom, this is the time. And so we thought her insights would be really important and helpful to all of you. And I will say that Dr. Trower is experienced in boards, as a board chair herself, which always gives that practical experience. She's currently, I think, chairing the board of trustees of Riverwoods in Exeter. So with that, I want to thank you again for being with us today, and I'll turn it over to you, Cathy.
Great, Kathleen. Thank you so much for that warm introduction. And thank you to St. Anselm College as well, the Center of Ethics in Business and Governance. As you said, this is really an important moment for all of us. And so thanks to everyone who's joined us. I'm really delighted to be with you. And it's great that we have this opportunity to do this in this format. We had actually hoped to do something really interactive, but It won't be quite as interactive, but I think it will be nicely interactive as you do enter your questions into the Q&A. And I will pause. So you sometimes, if some of you have seen me, you wonder if I take a breath in between statements and I just kind of get into it. So I do breathe and I will pause, and I promise you'll have an opportunity to interact with me and with the material that I'm presenting. And today in particular, as you noted from the title, missions and mindsets in this moment. And as we talked about putting this together, we're really thinking about how essential it is that good governance happen for nonprofits right now. I mean, if there was ever a time when you could get by with dysfunction, this is not it. This is a time when boards really have to step up their game, and hopefully they were already on that path. It makes it a little easier in this time of COVID-19. But it's just absolutely critical. So you will see as my screen is there we go. I'm going to start with some comments around mission and values-based decisions. And that's just a backdrop for everything else we're going to talk about. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time there, but it is an important, I want to make a couple of key points there. I'm going to walk us through 3 very useful models. Now, these are not easy models to grasp, but what I've tried to do is put them into soundbite fashion, if you will. I've tried to condense them into things that you can easily take in this medium. And then also, so that's the Conifen framework, adaptive leadership, and then governance as leadership, but we will pause after the first 2 frameworks there. And I will be throughout all of this showing boardroom applications and examples so that you get the concrete feel for each of these models, which can otherwise, as Kathleen said at the outset, governance is leadership. It's not a simple thing to just grasp quickly, although I know some of you have probably had doses of governance as leadership along the way in your journeys. And you may also have come into contact with Conifen framework and adaptive leadership. And then we will round things out with some helpful mindsets for boards to have in this moment. Some of these concepts are in my book, The Practitioner's Guide to Governance as Leadership, which you can find on Amazon or at other booksellers. So I'll start, as I said, with mission and values-based governance. I would say that mission matters perhaps more than ever before. Your nonprofit missions are absolutely essential. And keeping your eye on your mission really, really matters right now. Our core values matter perhaps more than ever before, because we are in this pandemic. People are searching for values-based organizations, and we really need the nonprofit sector in this moment, I think, again, more than ever before. So it's essential that we ensure that board deliberations keep mission front and center, and that our values are always explicit in our deliberations and certainly in the decisions that we're making as boards. And I was reading a novel and came across this. I don't know who said it. It wasn't the author of the novel, but I've seen this before and I really like it. How you do anything is how you do everything. So keep that in mind as we go forward. So what's the boardroom application here? Before deciding, ask a set of questions such as these. How does our mission guide us in this moment? What is our true north? That is, what is our social purpose? Purpose front and center. What core values should drive our thinking and responses to this issue? So whatever issues you're facing right now, and I know many of them are COVID related, and all the things that are coming out of that. And some of this driven by politics, by economics, and all the technology, all the other things that we're confronting right now. Keeping your mission and values front and center in your boardroom by asking specific questions. What core values should drive our thinking and our responses? What principles should underlie our decision and actions? If we decide an issue this way versus another, what does this reveal about who we are and what we stand for? So as you're thinking through, there's different ways to solve a problem. There's different responses a board can take. Think about, if we decide it this way versus this way, what does it reveal about us? what must we not lose or compromise along our path forward? And what is best for the desired social outcomes we seek? So these are just a set of questions. You don't have to use all of them. I want to give you a lot of examples of questions you can use as you think through decisions with your board. Another thing to think about right now is risk and risk tolerance. A lot of things feel risky for people right now, even, mask wearing, not wearing a mask, certainly risky. And so a lot of us are confronting in our nonprofits and in our boardrooms the notion of risk, maybe more so than ever before, and maybe in different ways than ever before. So getting a feel for how the senior team, the staff, and the board think about risk. How do we think about risk? What does it mean right now? What would have to be true for us to? I love this question. What would have to be true for us to fill in the blank? Okay, so as you're deliberating something, you're in the boardroom, and you can take this right down to your family. What would have to be true for us to travel for Thanksgiving? What would have to be true for us to get together with people? In your nonprofit, what would have to be true for us to reopen a facility? The office, we're working home right now. What would have to be true to have face-to-face meetings? Whatever those, and these are just, some simple examples. You're confronting even bigger issues than that. But I love that question. And that way you could, individual trustees can weigh in on that. Well, for me, what would have to be true is X. And for somebody else, it's Y. And then you start to think about the collective, what would have to be true, and how does that shape how we're seeing risk and how our responses might unfold as based on that. How do we define success right now? And it's probably different than how we defined success a while ago. And in fact, many organizations have to rethink their strategic plans right now. And they have COVID plans. They have shorter term plans of how we're going to get through this and move beyond this. What does success look like? What risks will we take to achieve it? And I mean, the parallel question is, what risks will we not take? Are there potential negative consequences we're not discussing? This is essential because this will open up the thinking in your boardroom, because lots of times we don't want to confront those negative consequences. We're so busy thinking about what do we want to achieve right now that we're not thinking about, are there potential negative outcomes here and potential negative consequences that we need to get out on the table, at least to make sure they're out on the table and discussed. What are our blind spots? That is one of the toughest things. They're blind spots, right? How does a person see their own blind spots? Well, you have to ask others. You have to invite others in. Same way with groups, that is boards. You don't see your blind spots if you're not laying things out there and asking for feedback. And so really opening that up to say, gosh, have we got blinders on? Are we all like going along in a certain direction and nobody's really pushed us back and said, what if we thought about this in a different way? Are we being short-sighted? This is another thing we're seeing boards do because of the challenges right now. It's easy to kind of just take, we can get so focused on the short term, which is absolutely essential because we've got to get through this, but not be short-sighted, because the board's job is to take that long view and to make sure we are looking forward and beyond. So I want to take this into now this framework for sense making during periods of change, because we are absolutely in a major period of change. And this comes from the Cunningham framework, which helps leaders determine the prevailing operative context so they can make appropriate choices. Now those are big words, prevailing operative context, but in the next slide, you'll see what we mean by that. Each domain that we see ourselves in requires different actions. So here's, so this is from a leader's framework for decision making, came out from Snowden and Boone in Harvard Business Review in 2007. So that's many years ago, but it is so appropriate for today, and I love it. And there's actually, if you look up Snowden Cunningham framework, you'll find some great YouTubes on it that explain it in simple terms. But here's the idea, that there are 4 environments in which we find ourselves: simple, complicated, complex, or chaotic. And there's different responses needed from leadership. That is CEO or executive director, and boards. The simple is easy, right? Cause and effect is clear. There's one right answer. We're dealing with known knowns. We can use fact-based management. The leader's job is to sense what's going on, assess the situation, the facts, categorize them, we just organize them, and then respond. In a simple domain, that's easy. We can delegate and we can rely on best practice. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because those days are long gone. And in fact, there might be some aspects of your organizations that are still simple. You know, there's right answers around accounting, for example. But we are definitely over on the right-hand side of the chart in most of our organizations. So as we move into that complicated space there, you see that cause and effect is at least discoverable. There's more than one right answer. We're dealing with known unknowns. So at least we know what the unknowns are. Again, we can use management, fact-based management. So we sense, assess the facts, we analyze them, investigate different options, and then respond. The typical leader's job here and with boards is to create a panel of experts. And in fact, many of our boards are panels of experts. We have put people on our boards because of the expertise they bring. And we can rely on good practice. Move over to today, either complex or chaotic. Cause and effect is unpredictable. There's no right answer. We're dealing with unknown unknowns. We require pattern-based leadership. You see that in complex or chaotic domains. In complex, leader's job is to probe, explore options, then sense make, and then respond. So the idea is to open up the discussion and generate ideas. So we're going to talk about governance as leadership because that's a way to open up the discussion, as is adaptive leadership, which I'll talk about in just a minute. What we need in complex environments and complex times is emergent practice. We have to rely on what is emerging. This makes board members nervous because it's not good. Well, what happened to good practice and best practice? We're in the domain of emergent practice. We are in the domain of emergent strategy, which you can also look up online. It's a great thing to look at as you're thinking about your strategic plans. Mintzberg and others have done a lot of work on emergent strategy. In the chaotic, and many of us were thrown into chaos, and some of us are still dealing with chaotic moments. High turbulence, no right answers. We're dealing with a lot of unknowables. It takes pattern-based leadership. The leader's job is to act. You've got to take action in chaos, and it's hard to do and it's scary. But this is where CEOs and executive directors need the support of their board to allow them to act, then assess, and then respond. But action has to come because you can't allow your organization to stay in chaos for any long period of time. Look for what works, rapid response, novel practice. So that summarizes the Conifin framework. And I now want to take this into a boardroom application. Ask yourselves in your situation, what is known? If there are things that we know, we can solve for. Okay, with management, maybe it's a management solution. What is unknown? This is what we need to ponder. What is unknowable? Now we can try to see around corners, and I'm going to give you some examples and some ways to do that in just a moment. One thing that we've done with the board I chair, Riverwoods Exeter, is with management to talk about what's knocked out of whack for us right now. Now, Riverwoods is a continuing care retirement community, and we've got to keep our residents safe. As those of you who are also in those kinds of organizations, colleges, universities, et cetera, hospitals, certainly, we've got to keep people safe. That's first and foremost. Certain things have been knocked out of whack. Budgets are one of them, but that's temporary. What's knocked out of focus right now is temporary but it could have lasting ramifications. Things that are knocked out of whack, you can get back in, you will resolve those, you will be able to manage those again. When things get knocked out of focus, and this goes back to where I started with our mission and values, we can't lose sight of those. We might lose sight of some of our focus or the things we thought we were going to focus on this year, but we can't lose sight of them forever. So we have to think about what's being knocked out of focus right now so that we're thoughtful about it and we make sure we bring it back into focus when the time is right. And so an interesting thing to do is this method: what, so what, and now what. Again, this is a Boardroom application. Now, this framework is used in many contexts, and you might have seen it in some context out there. The source for this particular description that I'm showing is from Forbes, and you can see the website there by George Bratt in January 14th, 2020. So the what, ask yourselves what. That's the facts and possible scenarios. You're not pretending to know what's around corners, but you're thinking through what could be around corners. So what do we see? If there are certain facts, but then there's also certain scenarios, and I'll give you an example in just a moment of this kind of scenario thinking. Then the question is, so what? So once we have a handle on and we're talking about the what, we get into the so what. These are opinions and conclusions drawn from the data that we have, that is the facts we have, and the scenarios we're building. And this is where the board adds insight. So we say, here's what, so what, insight. Determine which scenarios to prepare for and which you're going to have to ignore, because you can't do it all. I love this actually, in this Forbes article. Here's where the how stupid would we feel question comes into play. Ask how stupid you would feel if each scenario came to pass and you weren't ready. Then focus on the ones that would make you feel the most stupid if you did not prepare, because that's the ones people are going to look back and they're going to say, where was the board? What was the board thinking? What was management thinking? What do you mean? Now, this doesn't mean we have 20/20 vision and we can see into the future. It doesn't mean we have crystal balls, but we can, in our context, walk through these scenarios and start to think about which ones should we be most prepared for. And this gets into the now what. Turn those opinions and conclusions from that so what conversation into potential actions. Get everyone ready to react to the most important scenarios. Everyone should know what to do if those scenarios play out so they can move directly to action. In many ways, the difference between a crisis and an opportunity is how well you're prepared to deal with it. So this framework, building on that Kinefin framework, is very, very useful in the boardroom. So here's the example that we went through recently with Riverwoods. Management came up with dark, medium, and light scenarios for a whole host of things that we need to be thinking about. You see this great big long list here, something like 11 or 12 things. So vaccine, therapeutics, and testing, the economy, recession, real estate markets, because we offer housing to seniors, supply chain. This has become incredibly important for organizations that have to provide PPE, but other costs. The very CCRC model in this case, because this could threaten the CCRC model, as it has certainly nursing homes. Sales and marketing, workforce. Workforce is a huge issue here in New Hampshire. I imagine it is a lot of places. And of course, we know nationally that it's been a big issue because a lot of people have gotten assistance and they're staying home. And we know that unemployment rate is sky high, but a lot of people are afraid to go to work, don't want to go to work, and actually they're getting paid to stay home. So workforce is going to continue to have a major influence here. Resident expectations and satisfaction, in our case, prospective residents' expectations, collaborators, competitors, staff engagement. So this is a lot of issues. I know we have a raised hand and I think we have some questions in the chat. So I don't know. I'm not sure if the raised hand, you guys can deal with that, if it's a technical issue or a burning question. I will just take a quick breath to see if, looks like we're okay. All right. Or Kelly, do you want to jump in?
I think we're okay. I think the hand has been lowered and we can get to the questions in the chat when you're ready for that shortly.
Okay. I promise we will get to them. All right. Thanks, Thanks, Kelly. So this was a lot of work for management, but you know, they're fabulous. And I know that your staffs are quite capable of doing this as well. So dark, medium, and light, kind of worst case, moderate case, best case, if you will, but I kind of liked the dark, medium, and light. So we took that at a recent board meeting, and we had this all in advance, so we had plenty of time to think about it. And then we had a board discussion. So we had our management presented what's knocked out of whack, what's knocked out of focus. And we talked in small groups, virtually. You can go into breakout rooms. It's great. It works. Of the items that are knocked out of focus right now, what gives you the most concern? So one group went off and talked about that. Another group talked about what longer term impacts do you see if focus is delayed too long? And what constitutes too long is really important in that aspect, because somebody's idea of too long might be 6 months. Somebody else's might be 6 weeks. And it's important to get your handle on the collective thinking of the board. What is too long? And how does the organization think about too long? What problems need to be solved now and what can wait until later? What are the risks? This goes back to that risk. How much risk do we want to take? What are we willing to do? What are the risks of focusing on the longer term issues related to just COVID, longer term issues instead of just COVID? What are the risks of not focusing on them? So we forced ourselves to go through a conversation around that. And what ideas do you have to allow us to focus on these items? What role can or should the board play? So we went into breakout rooms. People knew their group ahead of time, so they had time to do some thinking. We had moderators, so there was somebody running each of those breakout groups, and then we had a staff member in each group who was actually doing the recording of the notes and then reported back. And then we had a collective conversation around all of this. We didn't get through all of it, but we will continue to work on that in the months ahead. So what you can do in those breakout sessions is a starter set of thinking and dive into it as a collective then, and then come out with some things. And management has come out with a lot of ideas that help them continue to drive us forward. Okay, I'm gonna move from that Conifin framework now into the technical versus the adaptive. This is adaptive leadership. And I'm going to show you, we're going to walk through this model. I'm going to show you an example and a boardroom application. And then that's where we're going to take our pause to start to take the questions that are coming in. So this comes from Ron Heifetz's Leadership Without Easy Answers way back in 1994. He has actually written another book in 2012 called Adaptive Leadership. And he talks a lot about getting on the balcony. You might have heard that term. There's a great 5-minute YouTube. You can Google that's adaptive leadership in less than 5 minutes. And this gentleman paints a picture of adaptive leadership. It's really cool and talks through the model. There's a lot of YouTubes on the topic. Ron Heifetz has also written most recently on adaptive leadership in COVID times. So he's right on top of it, because if there's ever an adaptive leadership moment, this is it. So I encourage you to check out some of those resources. The big point here, again, there's a lot in these books. They're fantastic books, and I encourage you to take them up. But here's the Cliff's Notes. We distinguish a technical issue from adaptive challenges in these ways. Technical issues are easy to spot. Know-how exists. So that goes back to that simple or complicated domains. Know-how exists. There are right answers, and someone has the answer. These can be solved by management. Solutions can be implemented quickly by edict. People are receptive to technical solutions to technical problems. Changes have simple boundaries. So we go back to that simple or complicated, they're bounded. Management, we can do fact-based management. They can be fixed solo, and we have the tools and experience to handle them. You remember, best practice, good practice, as opposed to emergent practice or novel practice, okay? That puts us over in the realm of adaptive challenges. So I'm tying these two models together now, the Conifin framework and adaptive leadership. Adaptive challenges can be easy to deny and difficult sometimes to identify. Why? We don't like them because there's no right answer. They make us uncomfortable. In fact, I talk to a lot of CEOs and executive directors who say, you know, I was hired to have answers. This makes me really uncomfortable. But we are understanding right now, nobody's got all the right answers. And we shouldn't put that kind of pressure on our CEOs and executive directors. The boards don't have the right answers, but we can come together to come up with good responses. And that's the idea. Importantly, with adaptive challenges, they require different lenses. They require that we look through the lenses of multiple stakeholders to our decisions. I'm going to talk more about that in the governance's leadership section, because generative governance is really based on thinking about how different stakeholders see this. So I think about Riverwoods, the continuing care retirement community, our residents feel they see things differently. You know, and our prospective residents see things differently. So solutions take time. You can't do them by edict. You can't just say the board decided or management decided. People resist acknowledging sometimes adaptive challenges. That's where I talked about earlier. Get the ugly stuff, the possible negative consequences out on the table. Try to think it through. Changes cut across boundaries, and they're complex in an adaptive moment. They require collaboration and learning, and I'm going to conclude today, or toward the end of our session today, about learning and the essentiality of learning right now. And why does management and boards get uncomfortable? Because needed responses are oftentimes outside our repertoire. Remember, it's not, we don't just have a panel of experts or a board of experts in different technical areas of expertise. Yes, we have that, but that brings insight into the things that we talk about. But we can't just solve it based on our technical expertise, these adaptive challenges. Let's look at an example to bring this crystal clear. And I'm going to use a hospital example here. Very different down that left side of the column, left column from compared to the right. Are the beds filled? That was a technical thing hospitals used to talk about years ago. Now it's about community health. We talk about balancing the budget, yes, but we're talking about our business model. We talk about short-term outcomes, yes. We also talk about long-term sustainability. Medical staff pay, it's important, but it's technical. Medical staff well-being is adaptive. Strategic plans, technical. Strategic thinking and adaptation, I'll talk more about adaptation in just a minute. Adaptive. Mission statement is technical. Mission relevance is adaptive. Declining market share, technical. Value proposition, adaptive. Access to care, technical. Addressing health disparities, adaptive. Transportation, technical. Social determinants of health, adaptive. Staff turnover, technical. Workplace culture, adaptive. And in the healthcare sector, hospitals moving from volume, which was technical, to value, which is where we are now. Hospitals would say we got to take care of the technical, yes, but we are very much around that right-hand column. And I imagine your nonprofits are as well. The idea is to spend board time on the adaptive challenges, not on the technical. All right, boardroom application, and then we're going to pause and take some questions. Are there technical aspects of the issue we're facing? So you can take a messy issue that you're facing, and you might be able to tease out some technical aspects. Okay, if you can, great, because somebody can fix them maybe. For the technical aspects, who should resolve them? That can be pretty easy as well, typically. Are we viewing an adaptive issue as technical, just so it can be more readily resolved? So this one, really think through with your organization, because if you're putting things too quickly into, oh, I know the answer, and sometimes you see this happen in the boardroom. Somebody says, oh, I've experienced that where I work, and this is how we handled it. Well, it's great, that's helpful, but it's not the only thing. So we have to be thinking about not trying to force an adaptive issue into a technical place so that it can be solved. And boards can put, I will say, boards can put a lot of pressure on CEOs and executive directors to almost as if they want them to treat an adaptive challenge as a technical matter so that it can resolve it. And we have to be careful. We have to resist the temptation to say, can't you just fix this? As we know, we're dealing with a lot of issues right now that can't just be fixed. What are the adaptive aspects to the issue? Or if we reframe something that we've been thinking of as technical and we realize this is actually adaptive, we need to think about it differently. How do we ensure that we don't rush into that solution, just fix it mindset? What aspects of the issue are interconnected? So as you're thinking through some of your adaptive challenges, there are actually many interconnections there, like synapses, so like if we move the needle in one way, it's going to have ripple effects or it's going to affect some other things. So a colleague of mine actually was somebody in an audience who was talking about this and kind of shouted out, oh, it's like 3D chess from Star Trek. And in some ways this is a bit like 3D chess. Now I have enough trouble with regular chess, so I don't go to 3D chess, but in fact, when you visualize 3 chessboards and moving different pieces in different domains on different chessboards, you're starting to get to the idea of these interconnections that you will see in the issues that you're facing. Also, keep in mind a couple of things. What problem are we trying to solve? And what problems might the solution create? So what problem are we trying to solve here? And that can be very complex. But then also think through what problems might the solution create? Because your job as a board, working with leaders, is to think through the possible outcomes. Yes, the intended outcomes, but also trying to think through some of the unintended consequences and unintended outcomes. All right. So those are the key aspects to those first couple of frameworks and ways of thinking. So we're going to pause now to reflect and get some of those comments, and I can go back to a previous slide if you want me to. So Kelly, what have we got?
Okay, and just a reminder that if you do have questions, please go ahead and type them into the Q&A panel. This is going back to the first boardroom application slide. Robin asks, how would you distinguish between values and principles?
Oh, interesting question. All right, so I guess I don't have to go back there, but I think there's not a huge distinction between values and principles. They're just kind of a different way to come at the issue that might open up thinking for people. So I don't necessarily know that there's a huge difference. Most of us have core values that are listed on our websites. They're part of our mission, vision, and values. And so those values, I think, become relevant here, and they are things that we talk about that we believe in. And so, for example, there might be one difference. So you might not have listed inclusivity as a core value, but it might be a principle that you want to apply. You might not have transparency listed as a core value, but you would want the principle of transparency to apply. So there might be the same, but there might be differences. So the idea is to get you thinking, do they open up a lens if you use the language a bit differently?
Thank you. Cynthia asks, how do you see the challenges of recruiting and onboarding outstanding board members in our current environment and the inherent risks of our current environment?
Wow. So I always encourage nonprofits to try to have a pretty deep bench of potential board members, people that you have been thinking about. Maybe they've served on a committee. Some of us have committees that you don't have to be a board member to serve on a committee. Maybe they've served on a task force. Maybe they've been integrally involved in your organization in a number of ways. So my best advice is always cultivate and have this potential team, deep bench of folks out there that you can call in. Now, having said that, this is a very difficult time to bring on new board members. And I realize some of us have to. Some organizations have actually suspended bylaws a little bit in this moment, and it's okay to say, instead of rolling a bunch of people that were going to go off the board, we're going to ask them to stay another 6 months. So you can sometimes extend the term of some people. I don't recommend extending terms indefinitely, but during this time, it's okay to extend a term under special circumstances. If you are bringing on new board members during this time, and I know many of us are, and we need to continue to do that, you're going to have to spend, I think, more time one-on-one with the board chair and the CEO or the governance chair, talking to, and actually, if you're bringing on more than one, you can do it together. So you can bring them on together, which is always a nice thing to do, so they're not the only one person that's new to the board. And spend some time in virtual space with them, or talking over the phone, but I love virtual because we can see each other, about where we are as an organization, how the challenges were, being very upfront about the challenges we're facing right now. Try to get them enculturated into the culture of the board and how the board is working right now, even remotely or virtually, and assign a board buddy. This is important, even not in these times, but right now more than ever. So somebody who's been on the board a while is probably maybe somebody on the governance committee. That's one way we use our governance committees, is to assign each of those new members a board buddy, so that after, they can even chat with that person. I don't like personal chats during board meetings, but certainly after the meeting to say, what was that all about? And just make sure that that person is feeling supported, but that they really understand the role and the culture of the board, and how this is impacting the organization, and how it's impacting your executive director and the senior team. Because this is the other thing that's happening in this moment, is we as boards are not as close in with our senior leaders, with the entire staff team. Most of us are, certainly with our ED or our CEO, but there's a further remove with some of our other staff members, and that's not a good thing. We want to make sure that those connections are still solid. So those are just some thoughts on that.
Tara writes that she'd be curious to know how you define governance.
How do I define governance? Well, technically, governance is the legitimate authority to make decisions. That's the technical definition of governance, the legitimate authority to make decisions. Good governance, to me, is defined as having diverse people in an inclusive culture, having the right conversations on the right issues at the right time, for a kind of a shorthand for good governance. So you're thinking about board composition, you're thinking about the structure of the board, how it meets, you're thinking about the culture of the board, how they work together, how they think together, and that they're dealing with the right issues at the right time, instead of extraneous issues or personal agendas or things that don't really matter. But governance is the legitimate authority to make decisions. That's what boards do.
Thank you. I think we'll take a couple more here and then we'll move on. Tom asks, once you've clarified where you're going, how do you create alignment with staff and consumers of service?
So I think you should involve staff along the way as you're working on that, so that they're not misaligned. Certainly so that they understand, and they understand their place in that. So I think that's the CEO working through the organization to make sure the staff is aligned as that's evolving. And then, as far as, what was Kelly, the customer? It wasn't quite the word.
Consumers of service, clients, I think.
Yeah, the consumers of service. So I'm not a communications expert, but I would say that right now communication is key. And I can, using the Riverwoods example, our CEO has created videos. I mean, she's interacting with our residents weekly. So there's been updates. We have a way to communicate, certainly with the consumers of our services. Lots of communication. You cannot over communicate right now. People don't have to partake of those if they don't want to, but I think that CEO for your executive director being front and center, and sometimes it's your board chair too, but really letting your consumers know that the organization is okay, they're okay, these are our plans forward. I know a museum that I'm working with actually has beautiful grounds, and they had to close the museum. They couldn't have people close in, enclosed in space and all of that, but they have beautiful grounds. So one thing that they've done in terms of messaging is get the words out, come enjoy our grounds. This is so this was obviously over the summer, and just beautiful. Come see our flowers and enjoy the experience outside the museum until we can get you back inside. So I thought that was a really nice example. But thinking through with your marketing people, if you have any people on your board who actually are good with technology, I think social media is another great way to stay in touch with the people that you need to.
Okay, how can we convince a board to take the time needed to fully think through adaptive challenges when it might put them in a somewhat uncomfortable place of not having the answer right away?
That's actually going to be a great segue into the next session. I'm not going to put it off until then. I will just say that the governance leadership model really helps with that one, because it's about asking great questions. It's not about having the right answers. It's not about asserting your opinion and louder each time you assert it. It's about stepping back and allowing people the space to think. I also think, so this isn't about, the big ego in the room that has to have the right answer. In fact, yes, this does make people uncomfortable. It does mean taking more time. And I think this puts a little bit of the onus on the staff to make sure you're getting materials to the board in advance so they can do some critical thinking before they come into their virtual space to talk about the issues. So put as much out there to get them thinking. And then it's the questions that you pose. It's the questions that you bring to the table that will help create the environment where it's okay to not know everything. And actually, it's much more about what questions are we thinking about? What questions are we putting on the table? Are we receptive and open to doing that emergent thinking, that critical thinking that needs to come forth? So I think the governance as a leadership model will help you think through that still more. But I love the question. It's a great one.
Great. Well, with that, why don't we move on, Cathy? We do have a few more outstanding questions, but we'll try to get to as many as possible at the conclusion of the presentation.
Fabulous. Thanks, Kelly.
Sure.
So here's the governance as leadership model in its most simple form, I think. And this was the initial one that the authors, Chait, Ryan, and Taylor came up with back in 2005. Actually, before that, that's when they published the book. And it looks at this as these three modes or mental maps or mindsets: the fiduciary, the strategic, and the generative. The fiduciary mindset is your duty of care. As all nonprofit boards, you have a duty of care to protect the assets of the organization and your legal oversight of the organization, to ensure the efficient use of resources in pursuit of the mission, to hire and support and evaluate, compensate the CEO. That's all that's in the fiduciary. Boards have this down in spades. The danger in this moment is that we get all fiduciary and we lose track of the strategic and generative. And this is not the time to do that. We have to pay attention to that. And remember, budgets are out of whack right now. Some of those things that we know we're responsible for from an oversight point of view are essential. But we as boards can't lose sight of the adaptive challenges and the complexity and chaotic aspects of this environment. And we can't lose track of strategy and the generative thinking, because that feeds everything else. So you see here the strategic mindset or mental map that we also know about, most of us very familiar with: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of our organization, understanding the marketplace and competitive forces in our marketplace, thinking strategically to take the organization from where it is now and what we're dealing with into the future. Come out of this moment better than you went in. Come out, our CEO says, never waste a good pandemic. It stinks, but if we come out the same way we went in, then shame on us. We need to come out better for this. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. Generative thinking helps shape the thinking in the other two modes. It helps envision and define the future. So if we want to go to this future, how do we think about that future? It relies on those mission and values-based or principles-based questions that we started out with. And we discuss here in the generative mode how key stakeholders view the issues. And this also gets off to the question that was just posed. This gets us out of that mindset of I'm the only stakeholder that matters. You know, we're the board, we're supposed to decide. We need to put on those lenses and look through the eyes of other stakeholders. That's what this helps us do. Now, I wasn't wild about this depiction of governance as leadership because it looks like there are these three equal things that boards do with this triangle. So actually the authors weren't either really excited about it. So they came up with this depiction. And this just shows that the opportunity for that generative thinking, that generative work is upstream. So there's a stream, you see that little stream, that little kind of S-shaped curve going down. Sense making. The generative mode is about sense making. The strategic mode is about direction setting. And the fiduciary mode is about execution. So over time, you lose your opportunity for generative work because you're down into execution. That's not the time to run something back up the generative curve. You'll drive people crazy if you do that. And I mean, we've seen examples and we probably experienced those on some of the boards where somebody like raises their hand and says, well, did we ever think about, you know, you're like, whoa, okay, yeah, many months ago, or we thought we resolved that. So it's not the time once things are down into execution. Boards add value all along that curve going up. So we add value in fiduciary, strategic, and generative mode. And you can see the difference in the kinds of questions. We have the oversight, can we afford it? Slightly upstream, an inquiry type question. What's the opportunity cost? Okay. You know, if we're talking about our audit, the oversight question is, do we have a clean audit? The inquiry question is, what do we learn from the clean audit? That's an important question to ask. In strategy or strategic mode, we're talking about planning. What should we do? What's the plan? Going upstream, way upstream in strategic mode is the thinking. What do we think? What's the big idea? And way upstream still more is this generative idea, framing. Why does this issue matter? How do we look at the issue? How do stakeholders look at the issue? Even being clear about who your stakeholders are in any given decision-making context that the board is in will help you. Complex adaptive work requires more time upstream, and it goes back to that question about how do we get the board to take the time that they need to? We need to give them time in advance to think through the material they're going to be talking about in your virtual meeting, because virtual meetings require that we also cut down the time we spend, because we can't spend, 4 hours in a virtual meeting. So get that thinking in advance and then come prepared to tackle the messy stuff. Okay, this stream notion was very helpful for a lot of boards. It's like, okay, now I kind of get it. So my favorite depiction, which is not shown here, but it's actually of a triple helix. So you see all three of these strands, the fiduciary, strategic, and generative, intertwined. And that goes back to what I was saying before about 3D chess. Sometimes you can't just tease out the fiduciary aspects of an issue, or just the strategic aspects of an issue, or just the generative. And I'm going to show an example, a boardroom application in just a minute of what I mean there. But that's the essence of governance as leadership. So what are the mindsets needed to govern using this framework? There's the fiduciary, strategic, and generative, which we just mentioned. The mindsets are around the what, the how, and the why. The what, the how, and the why. Mindsets as stewards, as strategists, and as sense makers. And if you think about those three mindsets, those are different things going on in your brain when you're operating as a steward in your fiduciary role, when you're operating as a strategist in your strategic role on a board, and when you're sense making with the CEO and the team in the generative mode. Get a whole different feel. One person described this to me as, she said, well, stewards, I picture the board, leaning down and looking in at something. In strategy, I see them kind of tilting their head. And in generative, I see them kind of leaning back and kind of open. So it's kind of this visual way to picture these mindsets. I kind of liked it. What are the mindsets? Oversight, foresight, and insight. And if you want another way to think of it that's simple and easy to remember, the 3 M's, money, markets, and mission. It's an oversimplification, yes, because fiduciary is much more than money, and strategic is much more than markets, and generative is even more than mission. But I think if you look at these mindsets and the ways you see listed here, it helps you keep them in mind. And then once you have them in mind and you develop this vocabulary with your board, it's amazing how many light bulbs go off. Because actually, when you're in generative mode with your board and you're thinking about the why and your sense making together, it's not about your technical expertise, right? It's not about that. Now, you may say to a lawyer in the room, you know, bring us your legal mind to this in the generative space. And that's one thing. But you also want to get the legal mind into another mindset as well. We might ask the banker to come at this from that fiduciary standpoint, but also push them into that generative space. Open up the thinking. It's about asking a different set of questions, not having right answers. Here's an application on budget, which most of us think of, oh, that's totally fiduciary, you know, and it is in part, but it's all 3. So questions that you ask around budget. Are the assumptions that underlie the budget clear? Did we miss anything in the assumptions that gives you pause or raises a yellow or red flag for you? These are questions that management can bring to the board around the budget. Are there details you expected to see in the budget that you didn't see, that weren't included? Okay. Strategic mindset. Are the strategic priorities reflected appropriately in the budget? Is there anything that concerns you about these priorities? Do you understand the relationships among the priorities? Those are great strategic questions. In the generative mode, are our core values represented in the budget? Your budget is a manifestation, physical manifestation of what you value. That's really important to keep in mind. Is our mission advanced with this budget? How will important stakeholders view the strategic choices reflected in the budget? Generative questions, sense-making questions around something that you might otherwise think of as totally as fiduciary. And if all we did was look at the budget, is it balanced? Oh, let's move on. Right now, budgets are out of whack. Our organizations are spending money differently than they planned, right? So we have to start to think through these things. And as we prepare, doesn't mean you don't budget. It doesn't mean that you're not thinking forward into the next iteration of the budget, but we've got to apply that adaptive thinking, even in something that is typically fiduciary. And we have to think in these 3 modes around something like budget. Okay, here's an example from Girl Scouts. I know we have several people from Girl Scouts here. And I've done a lot of work with some of the councils around the country as well as national. Mission sustainability. This is something that I know is not just true for Girl Scouts. We are all thinking about our mission sustainability right now. And a lot of nonprofits, I understand, are really, really fragile and very concerned about how will we come out of this. And thinking about the Girl Scouts, as you think about Girl Scouts, and in light of the competition we face, what generative questions arise for you? So I would encourage you in any of your organizations to think about, as you think about your mission, your purpose, your place in this social sector, and in light of whatever competition or whatever else is going on, get your board to think about what generative questions do we have? Here's one specific to Girl Scouts, but again, you can think of the application. How do we ensure mission relevance and financial sustainability beyond cookies and camps? Because we couldn't open camp, perhaps. And cookie sales are going to be very different this year in COVID. Imagine, this is one Girl Scouts did. Imagine you're the board of a for-profit company that needs to reach girls and young women for online sales, but most or many do not have internet access. What questions would you pose to your CEO? Putting yourself in that for-profit space or mindset can really open up the thinking of your board. And it'll certainly engage the corporate members of your board, the people that come from that mindset. but it'll just engage everybody. It opens up. Again, what we're hoping here is for emergent ideas, novel practice. However, now these last questions, like this one, this is for everybody. How have we traditionally thought about fund development? What does that tell us? How is that helpful? How is it limiting? How might reframing potential donors as investors help us raise money? This is one that they do with the United Way, one of my clients down in Dallas. Reframing potential donors as investors. You think about it, people who give to nonprofits have a lot of different places they can donate their money and their time, if that's the case, for board members, certainly. But they're also making an investment. If you think about them as investors, they want to get return. They want to get value for that investment. So it might open up some thinking. What do we provide for girls that no other organization can or does? And you can substitute your own whatever we provide that nobody else does. If a donor gave us 50 million, what would we do with it? Now that's a lovely question, right? And we can dream about it. But the point of that question is it gets us thinking, because if we thought about what we're going to do with it, we might be able to actually show. It might help us come up with an emergent strategy. It might help us come up with new ideas to help us show and bring in others that will help us sustain our relevance and sustainability, thinking through the answer to that question. Okay. COVID is a complex adaptive challenge that requires thinking in the 3 modes. I mean, that's the headline from this particular talk that we've been having. This is a complex adaptive challenge. Here's a boardroom application of trimodal thinking in action during COVID. And this is a large federated organization asking about the decision of whether to go forward with their in-person conference for 2021, which had to be virtual this year. And they had to move, as a lot of organizations had to do, move virtual fast. What strategic and generative questions come to mind? And these are some of the questions that the board generated. Now you can think about your own question here as you think about an issue that you see for next year, or you see post-COVID, or you see, because we don't know really what the post-COVID world's going to be like. We know it's going to be different. So they ask questions, and we didn't force them into boxes. We had them in small groups virtually, and just said, what questions come to mind? And then I put them into these categories after that for the purposes of this talk. Things like, is it safe? Are there any restrictions on the budget for facilities and keynote speakers? Can we afford to not have it in person? What changes would it mean for the organization, for the staff? What does attendance look like if we went hybrid? So we did some in person and some virtual. What additional information do we need to make a decision? Great fiduciary questions. Strategic. What would be the strategic impact on our programs and on other events? How were our members impacted by COVID? Who will miss out if we hold it in person? How can we best serve the maximum number of members? What would be our focus for next year? What is our longer term strategy beyond 2021? So they're forcing themselves to think beyond. Generative, what sense do we make of who attended virtually this year, who haven't attended previously? What will the sector need in the decades ahead? What have we learned from 2020? And I'm going to come back to that question in just a moment, and then we're going to take some more questions. Learning, everything you can do right now to learn is critical. What value have we derived in person that's lost virtually? What new value is delivered? So force yourself to think both sides of whatever's going on, because there's good and bad coming out of the decisions that we're making now, of the thought processes we're going through. How do we enhance the value to stakeholders, whichever way we go? Excellent trimodal thinking during COVID. All right, I said I would talk a little bit about 2 other mindsets, the entrepreneur's mindset and the learner's mindset. So entrepreneur's mindset is outcomes oriented, it's adaptable, it's resilient. Resiliency matters right now so much. There's intentionality to an entrepreneur's mindset. It is decisive. So there is a certain amount of decision making that has to be made. It's humble. Mistakes take you forward in an entrepreneur's mind. It's focused on why. You know, why does the market need this? Is there something we can do that isn't being done or we could do differently? Critical thinking, willing to take risks. So there's certain things that come to mind when we think about entrepreneurs. About learners, process oriented. We need to be paying attention to process right now. Yes, outcomes, but also process. Learners' mindset is curious. It's about asking questions, right? That's what learners do. They're asking questions. Kids ask questions. We need to ask questions. So curiosity is a wonderful thing that we need in the boardroom. It's collaborative. It's about listening, carefully listening to each other, able to unlearn to learn. So we have to unlearn some things about how we've always done it because we have to let go of that to learn. It's about humble. It's about being humble. Mistakes help you learn. It's focused on why, it's critical thinking, and it's open to new ideas. So just some of the ways that I think about those two mindsets are different types of mindsets that I think will be very helpful to you in your boardroom. Okay, let's do a boardroom application then around learning. What is the staff learning about the organization right now? And I'm going to show you what Riverwoods came up with in terms of staff learning, and it's fabulous. And I think it will open up some ideas for you. What are we learning about governance? This is something that the board is also keeping track of. What are we learning about governance? What is this telling us about ourselves? Are we starting to see fissures in our culture? Are we starting to see factions? Are we starting to see, are we actually seeing improvements? Peter Eckel and I, E-C-K-E-L, wrote a paper, and I'm happy to share it with you, but it's called Governing in and Through a Pandemic. I did a blog for it for BoardSource, so you can go to boardsource.org and find Governing in and Through a Pandemic there, at least the BoardSource blog version. But the idea is there are things that we should be learning right now about ourselves as a board that we're going to want to continue. And there are some things we're learning that we're going to want to fix. Are we learning anything that might cause us to rethink our assumptions that have driven us in the past? This is an opportune moment. If we can take the space and you might even have a little task force go to work on this. What are some of the things that we're learning that are saying, what do we need to unlearn so we can learn? Rethinking assumptions. What have we learned we should stop doing? What have we learned we should start doing? In your work, this is a great question to ask your board members. In your work or in your experience, if they're not working, some of them aren't working outside the home, what has been the most impactful learning through this pandemic? I mean, let's face it, we're learning things about home and about family and about community. So great question to pose to your board. So here's the staff learnings that came out. Put this question to all of the staff, and then got back 100 of responses, and then put them into these categories. This is a time of great meaning. All staff members are doing important work. We're learning the importance of relationships, gratitude for people over things, and kindness. We're learning perspective and resilience. I love this. Even though it might not seem like it sometimes, things could be worse. We're learning patience and control. And I know those are not my strong suits. I really happen to learn these things the hard way. Control what you can, cope with what you can't. It's going to be weird for a while. And those quotes just meant so much to me when I heard those from staff members. And it's very powerful. It's like the what, the so what, and the now what. You know, it's like, what can we control and what can't we? What's unknown and unknowable? Unity. Have a common goal, stay focused on the mission. Small irritations don't matter, we're better together. And leadership. Leadership doesn't require perfection. There's no perfect plan for a novel virus. Communicate and adjust. This goes back to that question around communication, so critical. People want to know as much as possible, as quickly as possible, even if it will change. And that was behind the thinking for the CEO to say, look, here's where we are this week. Next week's going to be different. So beautiful learnings from us to you. And I encourage you to do this with your own organization and then share it with your board, because this opened up a whole different conversation for our board too. We have to not underestimate or underappreciate our staff right now, who are also working around the clock to get things done, to keep our missions going forward in this moment. So a couple of images to leave you with before we take some more questions. Think compass, not map. This is not about a map with known territory, known terrain. We know exactly where we're going to go and we know how to get there. We know the shortest distance from A to B. Think compass with your board. You're a compass, not a map. And think navigators, not pilots. This is the one where we have to caution boards sometimes to say, look, we need your compass, we need your navigation, but the staff is the pilots. When we want you to help us, when we want you to lean in, we want you to, do something like that, we'll ask you, and we will put you to work on task forces and that kind of thing. But board, compass, not map, navigator, not pilot. All right, so we've got 20 minutes left if we need them. And so we've got a nice 15 minutes for more questions. If you've got them, they could be reflections, things you're thinking about. So Kelly, what have we got?
Okay. This goes back to the first half of the presentation. Molly asked,
can't do that. No, I'm kidding. Yes.
Given that most small to mid-sized organizations need to be able to shift between tactical and adaptive with their boards, do you have any recommendations for how to signal which approach is needed and pivot between the two?
Yeah, so I think to the extent that you can help your board see some of the technical issues and see the reframing as adaptive, spelling it out as concretely as you can, like this is what we see as tactical. These are the things, because you know what they are. These are the things that more adaptive. So spelling it out is helpful so that we have a common lens or frame by which we're looking at those, because otherwise some person's technical is actually adaptive and some person's adaptive they're seeing as technical. So you need to help them see what that is. The assumptions I'm really big on. I say this all the time, spell out the assumptions so the board can see why you see this as technical and what's adaptive. And once they understand the assumptions, and if those assumptions change, that means we have to move into the adaptive. So where we're tactical here on these things, and for now, things change. Those assumptions might have changed, or something in the external environment has changed. We're now in adaptive. Switch your mindset. So help them understand the mindsets, help them understand the concepts and the language, use specific examples, and that will help them pivot. And, so it's a little bit like sailing, and I don't know how many people sail, but the idea is you have a North Star, your purpose and your mission, but right now you're in rough waters. You're maybe in chaotic waters. Things are really complex, things are messy, and you're hitting some headwinds. And so like sailing, as you hit headwinds, you have to tack. You're not going to, so those are going to be tactics. We're going to veer off. This is more emergent. We still know eventually where we want to go, but we're going to tack for a while. And so you get them to pivot with you if they're thinking navigation, if they're thinking compass, and they're with you on that. So those are some concepts or ideas I have to help with that one.
Thank you. Rebecca asks, would you recommend board approval of 3 different operational budget iterations to correspond with the dark, medium, and light scenarios?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes, I actually think some discussion around that would be really helpful. And I know that's what our CFO does at Riverwoods. So as the CEO and others come together to map those out, then our CFO talks to us about these various scenarios. And we don't like to use best or worst. Right now, we're kind of using a little bit better or maybe a little better, but yeah, the dark, light, and medium. I think that's really a great approach to take, and get them to think about it with you. This is another way to help them with these ways of thinking and getting them to be more adaptive and not just locked into one thing. It will make your thinking better as the leadership team. It'll make the board's decision-making better as well. I think it's a great way to do it.
Patricia asks, as our organizations look at diversity, equity, and inclusion, what questions at the organizational leadership level should we be asking about traditional governance models?
Ooh, that's a tough one. Couldn't you give me an easier one, Kelly?
Big question.
There's so much packed into that, and I'm going to try to do a bit of a soundbite answer, but this is way bigger than that. So I think about, let me start with some framing, because that's really what this governance as leadership helps us do around DEI. Diversity is largely a fiduciary matter. I mean, it's largely a technical matter, if you want to put it in that. Inclusion is adaptive, right? So diversity, you can bring diverse views, you can add diverse people, and it's the way really that we used to think about diversity. Corporations did it, nonprofits did it, and we had a joke at Harvard that was, add 2 women to the chemistry department and stir. Like, okay, we added 2 women, but it had nothing to do with equity or nothing to do with inclusion. So the idea in the generative space is to back up and say, what are the questions? What are the generative questions? How do we think about equity? What does equity mean in our organization? What does it mean in our sector? What does it mean in terms of how we're delivering and to whom? What does it mean in terms and inclusion? What does it mean about who we draw into our conversations? Are we serving a diverse population, a diverse set of people out there? But we have an entrenched white model, a white dominant culture model. Many of our boards are driven by white dominant cultures, because many of our boards are all white, have been white, and for a lot of us will remain white. And it's not that white people don't get the DEI, but they get it in a different way, and they don't necessarily enter into those kinds of conversations, and they come at it. So part of what you have to do is expand the thinking, have people read stuff. This is how we get to our own blind spots. I actually wrote a blog for BoardSource that you can look at, and it's called A Message to My Fellow White Board Chairs. And it's around this notion of thinking about white space and black space very differently, and thinking differently about equity and inclusion. And of course, as a huge social justice issue in this country, across the country, affecting our sector, you've got to really get into that thinking and help people see their own blind spots. And they don't, because it's something that we don't want to see. This goes back to the, what do you not want to face? And so helping them read, think, ask a different set of questions, putting a different set of questions on the table to them will be very helpful. But that's my shortest answer I can come up with. And I know it was a long one, but if you have more questions on that or resources, my website is there. So I encourage anyone to also follow up with me there.
Thank you, Cathy. This is going back to the concept of donors as investors. Tara asks, what ROI do our donor investors hope to see?
And that is a great question. I think it's one you should take to your organization, because it's going to be different for every organization. But it's the right question. It's absolutely the right question to ask. What do we think they want to see? What are they telling us they want to see? We already know who our donors are. So what are they hoping that they're getting? And as you think about bringing on new donors and reframing that a little bit, you're probably going to see more things. It goes to the question of, if we had $50 million, what would we do with it? Because that can open up that thinking again around return on investment. What do I want? I want certain outcomes. Just like when I'm investing my money personally, I'm expecting a return on investment. I expect that same when I give donate my dollars to a nonprofit. I want something back from that. I want to see that organization succeed. What does that organization succeed mean? Talk about it.
Thank you. Marty asks, What if your staff leadership team feels they need to be totally on board for any agency changes before the board has exploratory conversations?
Oh, so this really gets to the timing, and I didn't talk about that a lot in this presentation, but when you bring things to the board matters, and you should bring things to the board upstream. Remember that generative stream. You want to first guess with your board upstream before you second guess downstream, or then have them second guess downstream. So I think this requires the CEO to really talk through with the staff. Look, this is an adaptive challenge. We know we're facing it. I want to get the best thinking of the board. And to get the best thinking of the board, that means I've got to invite them in early on while this is still messy. The CEO has to have comfort doing that, and that will help the staff feel comfortable doing that. You could even have, of course, that kind of conversation with the staff team. So it's not like this is just, these rules apply only in the boardroom. This is great fodder to have with your staff team. So how do we see the issue? How do we think different stakeholders will see it? Force your staff into those different stakeholder lenses. How do you think a member of the community will see this? How do you think the state will view this? How do you think students will see this? Patients, their families, whatever your stakeholders are, get your staff to open up that thinking, get them comfortable with the language. If they're comfortable with the concepts, they're going to be more comfortable going when you go to the board and how you go to the board. And actually, it also frees the staff up from always having to have all the right answers, because we don't right now. We're trying to figure this out together, and we want to get to collective wisdom with the staff and with the board. It's a great question.
Thank you. Gwen asks, you talked about governance as leadership taking time. How do you go about introducing this in the boardroom and advancing it as a model the board thinks about?
So there's a number of ways you can bring it in. You could take it into your boardroom just with today's presentation. So you could use some of this presentation. Welcome to use it. Some boards, chapter 1 of my book, Practitioner's Guide to Governance as Leadership, explains the model in about 18 pages. It's a lot of words, and it's small words, a lot of pages, a lot is packed into those 18 pages. But some boards use chapter 1 and they say, read chapter 1 and let's talk about what this means for us. You could, just try to introduce the concepts with a few slides or with a chapter or with a short reading. I can give you some other short readings if that would be helpful. And so you introduce it that way. Here's a different way of thinking. Here's these 3 mindsets. You can use an example. So chapter 2 of the book uses an example, and you can put the board into, and here's the one I use. Imagine you're the board of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And the executive director comes to you and says, should we lend 21 Monets to the Bellagio Casino in Las Vegas? And this is a real scenario, but it's not yours. Although if you are a museum, you might be right in there, but not all of us are museums. And so then you ask the board to write down, what questions would you want to ask the executive director if you're on that board and they just said, should we lend 21? I'm thinking about lending 21 Monets to the Bellagio Casino in Las Vegas. What questions would you have for me? And you can use any example like that. And one from your own organization or one from another one from a case study to open up the thinking. And once people experience it, it's really cool because people will ask questions like, will they be secure? Is this legal? How will this affect donors? People will ask why. What's this got to do with our mission? The board as a collective will come up with those 3 ways of thinking, and the power in it is when they see, wow, we can do this. Because they were asking questions, not just saying automatically, no, of course we shouldn't lend 21 Monets to Bellagio. Now they did do 21 Monets, 21 being casino, $2.1 million was what they got in return. So but it's fun. Get them practicing. My advice to you is get them practicing in the 3 ways of thinking. It also opens up not only how the collective thinks, but also how individuals think. So people get to see, oh gosh, all my questions were fiduciary, or all my questions were strategic, or I had some of each. It's fun, it gets them thinking, and then you can have them apply it to something closer to home.
Thank you, Cathy. Let's try to get to one or two more here. Tom asks, what do you think are the pros and cons of virtual governance?
So I think one of the pros of virtual governance is that people are focused. And one things we're seeing is that a lot of boards have trimmed the fat from the board agenda. And so it's keeping boards focused on what they should be focused on in this moment. And so I think that's the big one. A big one is focus. A big one is alignment around what matters. So that's that focus and then alignment, they go together. And this is something great. I think another thing that's coming out of it is really paying attention to what you're saying, because in a virtual space, you can't hog as much airtime. There just isn't as much airtime. But I think that's another one. So we're learning to work with each other differently. I think those are three of the big pluses. And we can meet at different times when, we maybe couldn't before. So I think that's been helpful. On the downside, we don't have that same social connection with everybody. We don't get to hang out in the hallway or have a cookie after the meeting, or have this, that social space. And on the other hand, I know for those of you who have national boards, I'm on the board of BoardSource, and we have people in California, and they're not spending a day traveling to us and a day traveling back. So I guess that's another plus. A plus for this is you can have a lot more people involved. So we shouldn't let the technology hold us back. There are pros. I think the biggest con is that. I really am a big fan of being able to see everybody's faces in a board meeting. So, keep your PowerPoints focused and use them appropriately. But then when you can get everybody's face on that screen, you want to see everybody's face on that screen, because we're missing those same body language cues that we get when we're face to face. So it's a little more formal, it's a little more awkward. The other down is that we don't have as much time. We can't really, but that's that's counteracted with the focus one. So those are some thoughts on the upside and downside. There's some more in the article.
Thank you, Cathy. Doug asks, how do we encourage boards to accept a higher level of risk during COVID?
I would go to that question, what would have to be true for us too, and start to explore it. And then let people talk about their fears. And once they get their fears out there and you start to say, maybe there's not as much risk as we thought. Maybe there's some risk opportunity. So where we were before COVID, a lot of organizations were talking about opportunity risk, and risk as an opportunity, and taking risks as an opportunity. It's scary, and we're not saying bet the farm. On the other hand, if we're not learning, we're not being more entrepreneurial, we're not going to get through this. So I think there's a certain risk taking that is involved just in having a different kind of dialogue, being able to pivot, thinking more adaptively. And once they start to get more comfortable with that and talking it through, and sometimes it's just a matter of airing your fear, and then knowing that management's got that, or we're in this together and we've thought it through together. Exploring those assumptions again really helps people get past this is too risky thing.
All right, well, I think we are about at the end of our time together. Cathy, if you wouldn't mind just advancing to that last slide there. I just want to thank you. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time this morning to join us. We thank the Center for Ethics in Business and Governance at St. Anselm College for making this event possible and partnering with us. We thank Dr. Cathy Trower. It's been such a pleasure to work with you. Any parting words this morning, Cathy?
I just want to wish you all the best through this terrible time, this horrible time, this hard time. And like I said, come out better, and please enjoy safely Thanksgiving with your loved ones or on your own if that's the case. I just wish you all the best. And I'm so glad you joined us today. Thank you. And thank you